I wanted you to take a moment just quickly with me to picture something. Imagine you're in a time of your life when you need emotional and mental support more than ever. But your loved one, your husband or wife, has dementia and is no longer able to provide that support. You need someone to talk to, but no one else close seems to understand you. They can't quite grasp what you're going through. They just don't understand what's going on for you behind closed doors. You're living with a loved one who 24/7, day or night, might start sobbing uncontrollably or shouting at you. And even if you could figure out the reason why, you can't reason with them. You can't calm them down with rational thinking. Every night you go to sleep not knowing how many times you're going to be woken up that night for no reason at all. You no longer remember what it was like to have a good night's sleep. You can't relax when you're around other people. You're constantly anxious. Every time you're around your friends or family, you can't relax. You're constantly watching out for filling in gaps, continue on stories, and helping out whenever your partner might need a helping hand. There's clearly significant issues, but every time you try and find a way to solve those problems, the person that you love is getting angry with you because they can't see the problem that you're trying to solve. Everything is a battle. How do you think you might be feeling? You might be feeling like you're living on the edge. You might isolate yourself. Social situations are just so hard now. They're just too draining. You're constantly anxious and stressed. It's hard to shut off, and you're probably just not thinking rationally. You can't seem to remember things the way you used to. It's just not sticking in your brain the same way. Chronic stress has been shown to reduce a person's ability to remember, to make decisions, and to understand things. And yet, every day, primary caregivers are expected to make important decisions for their loved ones, to fully comprehend what's being told to them, and to pass on that information to their other supporters as clearly as possible and answer all of their questions that they're asking. We expect them to be able to talk openly and honestly about all of the negative and difficult issues right in front of the person they are caring for. It makes me wonder, when you meet a primary caregiver, how much of a clear picture of their reality are you getting? How clear is that picture of their life and that person with dementia and the care that they need? Can she cook? I guess. My mum could put frozen vegetables into a slow cooker and some diced up meat. She could definitely cook. Can she dress herself? She certainly could. Buy oversized shirts, button them all up, and she can put them over her head. How are you coping? Everything's fine. I'm fine. The number of times I heard my dad say that. The primary caregiver certainly knows the situation best, and they're the best person to be making those decisions for their loved ones. But are they able to tell in that state, especially with the person they are caring about, what they need and what they are going through? So when assessments are being done on how much or what care is needed, sometimes it's based on a false reality. And when there's not enough professional care provided, the extra caring load falls heavier on the shoulders of those in their broader supporter network. We do what we can when our loved ones need it. But as secondary caregivers, we don't have any power or control. We can't legally step in and say, that's not right. This needs to be done differently. We're limited in the information we get and the influence that we can have on those decisions. As my mum's dementia worsened, I became more and more involved in supporting both my parents. It was lucky in a way that I had my first child as my mum's dementia was worsening. As parents in the audience would know, I had lots of time on my hands, I had lots of energy, I had lots of energy and time to support my parents. In fact, I probably looked more like the cat. I found my role became more supporting my dad, so he was able to support my mum. Over time, I found myself back at work part-time, supporting my parents and bringing up a small child. It's a situation that's becoming more and more common. But when I started Googling for advice or stories that I could relate to, I just couldn't find very much. There's a lot of information around for primary caregivers, but there's very little for those secondary caregivers. So over time, I found myself supporting and providing advice to friends and colleagues who have found themselves in similar situations. My advice to them generally is to go to as many of the meetings as possible with the professionals. So for me, all of the information was coming through my dad. But I realised that as my mum was going downhill, that his memory and how much information he could take in was getting worse. He was just trying to survive as best as possible. He'd been in a state of chronic stress for years. It physically was not possible for his brain to work in the way I wanted it to. So there I am, badgering him with questions, wanting to understand what's going on so I can help. And he's just not capable of remembering all those finer details while caring for my mum, sitting in the room when the assessments are getting done or listening to the information. It wasn't until I managed to finally get to some of those meetings that I could actually observe what was happening. The level of support provided depends so much on those assessments. With primary caregivers in the state I mentioned earlier, with the person with dementia in the room at the time, I was horrified when I went to my first ACAT assessment with my mum and dad and saw what was happening. I ended up slipping a note to the ACAT assessor that actually painted a bit more of a reality of what they were going through. So that next time that she asked, can my mum cook? Can she dress herself? That she might actually ask the questions and get them to demonstrate or explain what that means to them. It was a simple change, but the difference was enormous. By being at the meetings, I got the information firsthand and I could ask the questions that my dad wasn't able to or just didn't even think to. I was able to support the professionals to understand where my dad was coming from and to influence him towards decisions to better help my mum because I understood more of how he was thinking. But even with how well I knew my dad, it took me months, it took me so long to understand why my dad was rejecting support for cleaning when it was clear that he really needed it. He eventually admitted to me that he couldn't stand the thought of his neighbours seeing a cleaning van arrive at the front of their door and admit that he needed support in that way. But once I understood and asked the questions of what it means to get cleaning support, we learnt that actually it was our carer, my mum's carer, that was already coming into the house using their cleaning products with no cleaning label on the van to help them, just that little extra bit, so that my mum could spend more quality time with my dad rather than him spending time vacuuming or cleaning down surfaces. Which brings me The other piece of advice I provide is to be careful how much support they provide. The more support secondary caregivers provide, the less professional care the primary caregiver asks for. We all want to help, but we need to take into account that if the primary caregiver doesn't feel the need to get more support, you need to be prepared that you're going to have to take that load and it's going to increase. Regardless of how it is and the impact it's having on those around them, none of us want to talk to a primary caregiver about the struggles we're going through when they themselves are shouldering the care on a daily basis. Which brings me to another piece of advice. Seek professional support. I found myself so isolated. No one, even my partner, understood what I was going through. He didn't get the mental load. The constant worry of how my dad was coping, everyone was focused on the primary caregiver, and understandably so. But research has shown that the impact on secondary caregivers can be just as significant as that on primary caregivers, even when the secondary caregiver is not involved in the daily care. It's just as significant. And yet, they're the least informed and the least in control of those decisions. If secondary caregivers are better informed and more directly involved with the professional carers and medical professionals, our loved ones with dementia will most likely be better supported to live at home well longer. I feel fortunate to have known the amazing support carers that my mum had over the years. They listened to us and modified their care to specifically fit the needs and personality of my mum. My mum didn't have older age on Alzheimer's. She had early onset frontotemporal dementia. She was diagnosed when she was only 53. It was such a relief to have people who understood and could bring out the best in my mum. Like Hazel, who was my mum's first carer through Alzheimer's WA, she was older than my mum, but they were like sisters. They were always giggling and having fun. Hazel worked with my mum to put a book together of memories, pasting photos in the book and writing stories to go along with them. Every week they would choose a new recipe from Mel's cookbook. It's a very worn cookbook I now have on my shelf, and cook a new recipe each week. And there would be always giggles coming from the kitchen. It was a sad day when my mum progressed higher up in her care needs and we lost Hazel. But with the loss of Hazel came a new friendship. We were able to get a consistent carer for my mum, even though at the time that just seemed against company policy. For my mum, having a consistent carer who arrived at the same time every time was incredibly important. I'm forever grateful for the care manager for listening to us and making exceptions. My mum's new carer, Sarah the carer, is an amazing person. She always went out of her way to care for my mum and support my dad. She would often take her to a cafe or browse trinket shops, getting some exercise as they were doing it. And these were my mum's favourite pastimes. She used to love looking forward to Sarah coming and taking her out. She would get her dressed up for special days, like Melbourne Cup, and they just laughed and had fun together. Sarah was so much younger than my mum, but they bonded just like she did with Hazel. Losing Sarah was one of the hardest things about my mum going into full-time care. Among everything that we grieved someone who had come to see mean so much to my family. That loss. After so many years, I imagine the impact for Sarah would have been significant too. She would have been instantly fielded out to lots of new clients and families that she had to figure out and come to know. The instantaneous cut of my mum losing Sarah at the same time as being put into a full-time care home, all within a 24-hour period, added to the distress and loss for me, my dad, but most of all my mum. It was one of the most traumatic times of our lives, Of course, it all happened just after my partner flew off overseas for work. So my 4-year-old son had to witness it all. It all happened so quickly. But we were given no choice. We tried to throw money at it, but no one would listen. By the full-time care home or the support care provider, we could not do anything differently. I wish we could have had more time with Sarah. To thank her for everything she did for us. When I left the care home after moving my mum into her new room, on a whim I stopped and bought myself some flowers. I bought roses because they reminded me of my mum. My dad always had roses in the garden, and she loved them, loved the smell of them, loved having them cut flowers in the house. So I bought myself roses, and I still have roses. I put them in my garden as part of that memory. I also bought them as a reminder to myself, as my doctor had given me advice, to be gentle on myself. Sorry. As carers, we often put everyone else higher on our priority list. But if we don't remember to look after ourselves, how can we look after others? I think it's something which all of us need to remember sometimes, to be kind on ourselves. There are so many wonderful advocates speaking about their own experiences of living with dementia, and there are lots of advocates speaking about their experiences as primary caregivers of their loved ones with dementia. I've become an advocate for Alzheimer's WA to give a voice to the sandwich generation, those supporting parents with dementia while bringing up kids and often working as well, who don't have much time to speak up about what they're going through. And secondary caregivers who support the primary caregivers in caring for loved ones with dementia, who don't always have the time, the legal power to get information or the control to make those decisions. My dad has supported, loved and cared for my mum as she has declined over the last 15 years since her diagnosis. She's had an unusually slow progression for someone with frontotemporal dementia. I think my dad puts it down to adventure with dementia, getting a caravan against the professionals' advice. I wanted to share with you a picture of my dad's world as a primary caregiver from a perspective I gained over the last 8 years supporting them. I supported them so my mum could live at home with the best quality of life for as long as possible, which is all we really want. Thank you for doing what you do. And your work is appreciated more than you may ever know. Thanks.